Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening for me to share with you some of the research and work that I've been doing on microaggressions, macroaggressions, and micro-interventions. If we have an opportunity today, I would like to talk to you about our most recent research on micro-interventions and how they are used to disarm microaggressions. What are microaggressions? Well, microaggressions are the everyday slights, indignities, insults, and put-downs that marginalized group members experience in their day-to-day encounters with well-intentioned individuals who are unaware that they are perpetrating or engaging in an offensive or demeaning behavior towards the target individual. Tonight, I'm going to concentrate primarily on what led us to begin to think about microaggressions, which are racial microaggressions. But there are many other, almost any marginalized group member can be the recipient of microaggressions. There are gender microaggressions, sexual orientation and sexual identity microaggressions, religious microaggressions, disability microaggressions. Now, all of them share common social psychological principles in terms of how they operate, but their themes are quite different from one another. For example, women have themes of sexual objectification. LGBTQ individuals experience a very unique theme, which is sinfulness. Racial ethnic minorities experience different themes, and even within the groups, if you look at Asian Americans, African Americans, Latinx Americans, even though they have common principles that operate in terms of microaggressions, their themes are quite different. For Latinx Americans and Asian Americans, for example, a common theme is perpetual alien in your own country. For example, I oftentimes get complimented for speaking good English. And, I will generally say to them, thank you, I hope so, I was born here. And that is because when what appears to be a compliment is really a microaggression that contains what we call a meta-communication, a hidden communication that is outside the level of awareness of the perpetrator or the person who is experiencing themselves as good moral person who in essence is complimenting you. And its microaggressions are reflections of implicit or explicit bias. The ones that are most damaging, I believe, are implicit bias because they are reflections of worldviews of a person who believes in superiority, inferiority, normality, and abnormality. And that's one thing that we have to think about. A microaggression is not an isolated incident detached from the intent, the worldview of the individual. And I oftentimes get very disturbed, especially in business and industry, where people say, teach me what I should say or shouldn't say. And if you deal primarily with that, you do not make any internal changes. Because the reason why microaggressions come out is that they are implicit indicators of an unconscious worldview that needs to be addressed and changed. You can teach a person not to be microaggress, but in essence, the perception that they have of different groups of color is unchanged. Other forms of microaggressions will come out. I can teach a person about the meaning to me of saying that I speak good English, but in essence, they can avoid saying that, but it may come out differently. For example, they can come up to me and say, Dr. Sue, where were you born? And I'll say, I was born in Portland, Oregon. No. Where were you born? And I'll say, Portland, Oregon? I'm beginning to doubt it. And they'll say, no, I mean, what country were you born in? And I'll say the United States, and they get very embarrassed. But what I'm saying is that those are two forms of expressing that they perceive you as not a true American, that you're a perpetual alien or foreigner in your own country. And I know that some of you or others, when you talk about microaggressions, may begin to think about, well, those are harmless, trivial, insignificant behaviors. Maybe they were biased statements that were potentially negative, but, toughen up. Don't react that strongly to it. Give it up, Derald, and don't hold it against that person. They don't realize, as we will shortly see, that microaggressions are different from the everyday slights and incivilities, rudeness that other people experience. When we produced our taxonomy of microaggressions in 2007, in the American Psychologist, it was a taxonomy of microaggressions in which we identified three forms: micro-assaults, micro-insults, and micro-invalidations. When we identified it and talked about the hurtfulness, these psychological impact that it had, many of my other colleagues throughout the country wrote letters into the American Psychologist saying that they disagreed with the concept. They said that our research team was making a mountain out of a molehill, that microaggressions are trivial things and that you simply should toughen up, and they shouldn't, you're portraying people of color as being vulnerable. And this is something that we're going to address. It sent us back to look at the research, to conduct research, as to find out, are indeed microaggressions harmful? And we found that they are very harmful, both psychologically, physically, and not only are they harmful to an individual's well-being, but they create disparities in employment, education, and healthcare, because the microaggressions that occur are manifested in decisions of education, who's going to get hired, who's going to get retained, and who's going to get promoted. So it has a major impact not only on individual well-being, but on the standard of living of marginalized group members. I always like to start, as a example, a tribute to Maya Angelou, someone whose writings that I've read and whose voice I truly respected. And one of the things about Microaggression that I want to raise with you, in her poem, Still I Rise, she says, "You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may tread me in the very dirt, but still like dust I'll rise. You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still like air I'll rise." Now, many people of color can relate to what she is saying. There are several important aspects. Maya Angelou never used the term microaggressions, but indeed that was what she was talking about. She spoke that she is not, many people who read this poem think that she's talking about the white supremacists, the skinheads, the Klan. And she does talk about them, but she is primarily referring to the everyday, ordinary citizen like you and me, who are experience, as I've said, ourselves as good, moral, decent individuals, but engage in harmful behavior and impact. She talks about the everyday death by 1,000 cuts. She talks about little murders as opposed to the grand execution, the hate crime, the everyday slights and indignities that people experience, that people of color experience. But what is really revealing about what she is saying here is that she is saying not only, not only are people of color, primarily she's talking about African Americans, not only are they resilient, that despite all the bullying, the racism, the oppression, still they rise. Strength through adversity is what she begins to talk about. But she makes some very important observations that our research is really beginning to touch upon now. What are the forms of microaggressions? Microaggressions are manifested verbally, non-verbally, and environmentally. Now, when she says, "You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies," she is referring to the fact that education, textbooks, curriculum tend to portray people of color as being pathological, lacking in values, and on, and that the textbooks that are used portray people of color as being pathological, or they ignore them. And people don't see the impact of this. And we can talk about two aspects of this. When, one of the things that I can give you as an example of a microaggression, we are rephrasing it and talking it to be a macroaggression. And I'll try to give the distinctions, but it is very relevant to education. One of the things that we have been taught, and even though Lowen's work and lies, my teacher told me, gives the example of the fact that we were taught, and still people say it, that Columbus discovered America. Now, and this was, when I was a student, this was considered true. Everyone brought it. Columbus discovered America. If you talk to Native American school children, they know a completely different reality. In fact, they would oftentimes say that, how can we be discovered? We were never lost. In fact, if history is accurate, it was Columbus who was lost and thought he discovered the continent of India, and named the indigenous people Indians. Now, this is where there are two aspects. The reality that is imposed upon people, a reality that elevates the significance of white European males, and the denigration of indigenous people. They are the ones that are discovered. And we may not be, as children, be aware of what is going on, but this is something that affects our worldview and perceptions. And it provides many white students unwillingly the belief that somehow they are superior. And it provides a different reality for students of color. But where oppression really hurts very much strongly is when a teacher, for example, decides that she's going to test her students, in terms of how much history they have learned. So on a true-false test, social studies text, let's say, she asked this question: Columbus discovered America, true or false? All the white students say, that's a Mickey Mouse question, teacher. Of course it's true. Now, I want you now to think about the lived experience of a Native American student who is sitting in class, who knows a different history from what their parents told them. If they mark false, what happens? The teacher says it's wrong. You get graded low. Study your history, Johnny Echo Hawk, in order to understand really what real history, true history, is all about. If, however, the student decides to get the answer right and say true, they have betrayed their own sense of integrity. This is something that occurs to all of us, even in adulthood. When I say all of us, people of color are constantly placed under the pressure of forced compliance to go along with what is happening here. You may shoot me with your words. You know, microaggressions can be verbal as well, besides environmental. A person, you speak excellent English. Where were you born? Now, let me quickly backtrack. If those complimenting me for speaking good English and asking me where I was born is not necessarily a microaggression. But even Freud at one point said something like, even a cigar can be a cigar. Those of you in psychology know phallic symbols, things. But indeed, it may not, to compliment me or to ask me when I was born, where I was born, is not necessarily a microaggression, but in the context of someone saying, where were you born? I was born in Portland, Oregon. No. Where were you really? If you follow the context, then it becomes a microaggression. That's where it is so difficult, oftentimes, for people of color to determine, did what I think happened really happen? You're set into a psychological mindset and turmoil trying to, make this determine. You may cut me with your eyes. Microaggressions can be nonverbal. They're everyday occurrences. And one African-American student at Columbia talked to me about a situation that he finds occurs very often at the beginning of the start of a semester. He says that if a classroom has a series of tables where people sit around it, or if it's like this, and he goes in and sits down, the seats next to him are the last taken. You can ride the subway trains in New York, and if you want to find a place to sit down, look for a black passenger. It's really a communication. Or other black students at Columbia tell me that oftentimes when they get in and will sit down at a table next to white students, they notice that they pull their purses closer to them or kind of lean away. And the communication that is being read is that there is something dangerous about you. You're up to no good. You are prone to crime. And these types of communications are nonverbal, but they are very powerful. Now, why is this important to know? If you know the social psychological literature on nonverbal communication, what they find is that people of color are better readers of nonverbal cues than their white counterparts. I mean, it's not something innate, but there's a common saying of many African American colleagues that say to me, and that is that if you really want to know where Dr. Jones is coming from, don't listen to what he says, but how he says it. Now, behind that statement is a statement that the nonverbals are more accurate reflections of the beliefs, the biases, assumptions that people might have. So what I'm indicating to you is that these things are going on all the time. It's invisible to well-intentioned white brothers and sisters. And, these microaggressions take a cumulative toll and effect that occurs here. Let me read to you. These are narratives taken from students. My last name is a very Muslim name, and even though I act like everyone else, people make terrorist jokes. What's up, bin Laden? Or, oh yeah, you have a bomb in your backpack? I kind of looked at him and I was like, shut up, don't say that. And he was like, you know, I'm just joking. This is really something that oftentimes happens when a person thinks that this is funny, it's a joke, can't you take a joke? If you become upset about it, you are a person who can't take a joke. In other words, your response is pathologized or seen negatively when indeed it is a reflection of the impact that it's having. Here's another one. This is an African American female student. I was with a girlfriend who is white. We have been best friends since grade school. We were shuffling through yearbook pictures and she said, look at that N-word. I said, what? She said to me, not you, just them. You're not like them. You're different. You are a good person. I hit her and stomped out. Even though she later apologized, she was never my friend again. Now, this is a very common microaggression that, if you recall, Joe Biden made to Barack Obama. Remember when they were running for the Democratic nomination and people were announcing their candidacy, and Joe Biden announced his candidacy. Now, I want you to realize that Joe Biden is considered a friend of people of color. And he was asked about Barack Obama, who announced his candidacy, and there was huge excitement. And they asked him, why was there excitement? See, the reporters didn't want to ask him questions. They wanted to know about Barack Obama. And they said that, is there so much excitement about the candidacy of Barack Obama? And he made this statement, well, you know, for the first time, you have an articulate, nice-looking, attractive black man. That's a storybook man. Now, that represents a microaggression because, and you've got to understand what is being said. It appears to be a compliment. I'm complimenting someone who's running against me. I'm saying he's nice looking, he's handsome, he's intelligent, he's articulate, he's a good dresser. That's terrible. But all you have to do is ask that, you mean there's never been a nice looking, articulate black man ever? But more detrimental is the assumption, like is going here with this African-American female, you're not like them. Now think about that. You're not like all the rest of those black people who are unintelligent, dirty, who aren't bright and articulate. All of that. It allows a person to cling on to the image of one group having all these negative qualities. So this is something that even people of color, they know they've been offended. Joe Biden did not know why groups of African Americans were so angry and upset with the statement that he made. And it oftentimes happens in classroom. If a black student gets up and makes answers a question, a professor may something like, John, that was a most articulate and bright answer that I've ever heard. And why would the black student get upset? Because it may represent a microaggression in the sense that I'm shocked that a black student can be so articulate and bright. And again, I say you have to see it in context. And that any isolated case in itself may not seem to be on target or on the mark. Here's another one from an Asian American male student. I was at the convenience store with my Chinese friends. We were joking, laughing, and talking loudly when a white shopper told us to, quote, button our lips, end quote. One of my friends shouted, "This is a free country." The shopper yelled back at us and told us to go back to China. And then I thought, oh, wait, this is my country, and I was born here. Again, this goes on quite frequently. If you don't like it here, go back to Africa. If you don't like it here, go back to China. And we have a political situation where Donald Trump told the three congresswomen of color to go back to their infested countries and so forth. But the perception, again, is that you aren't a true American. Only true Americans look the following way. And this is powerful. Here's one on the effects. This is a Latina student. It seems to never end. You're different. You're stupid. You don't belong. You get angry but have to hold it in. How does it make me feel? It hurts a lot, especially if it comes from your friends and even your teachers. Explaining doesn't help. They will just say, it wasn't my intention. Why are you always so sensitive? Can't you take a joke? And I can't say anything because I am so emotional. I don't want them to see me cry or they'll think that I'm weak. This is an internal turmoil that goes on with individuals. When I was younger, and I would experience a microaggression, it would have a major impact on me. The process in our studies of microaggressions is that when a microaggressive incident occurs, the first question that comes, not necessarily in this order, did what I think happened really happen? Was this an intentional or unintentional incident? If it was intentional or unintentional, how do I respond? If I respond to it, what are the consequences? Now, this gets into the whole thing where when R.D. Lang, an existential psychiatrist, once asked the following question to mental health providers. Is schizophrenia an unhealthy response to a healthy society, or is it a sick response to a healthy society, or a healthy response to a sick society? What I'm getting is that oftentimes the reactions that occur with people of color, getting angry, what happens is that you're caught in a double bind. Your responses to microaggressions are pathologized. You're seen as the angry black woman, the angry black man, an insensitive or oversensitive, paranoid individual, a crybaby, a sniveler. What you're doing is, in essence, you pathologize the response that is generated by the unhealthy situation that people come through. I'm going to go quickly, skip this one, but this is the effect of a lifetime of being on the outside. This was a individual that a participant in one of our group studies, and he says it this way. This is an African American. It gets so tiring, It sucks you dry. People don't trust you. From the moment I wake up, I know stepping out the door that it will be the same day after day. The bus can be packed, but no one will sit next to you. I guess it may be a good thing because you always get more room. No one crowds you. You get served last. When they serve you, they have this phony smile and just want to get rid of you. You have to show more ID to cash a check. You turn on the TV and there you always see someone like you being handcuffed and jailed. They look like you, and sometimes you begin to think it is you. You are a plague. You try to hold it in, but sometimes you lose it. This is important. Explaining doesn't help. They don't want to hear, even when they ask, why do you have a chip on your shoulder? Shit, I just walk away now. It doesn't do any good explaining. There's a series of questions that I want you to think about, probably on your own. Is life as hard as this black man describes? Because what we have here is a clash of racial realities. A lot of people will say, oh, this is exaggerations. This is not really, why is a person being so upset? They tend to trivialize or minimize the experiences that are going on. The question, is he oversensitive or paranoid? Is he right in concluding that others don't want to listen to his explanations? Now, this last question has led us to begin to research racial dialogues. We have a book out called Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence. And what we find is that many well-intentioned individuals, even though they may ask questions, why are you so upset? Why are you so angry? Don't want to hear your answer. Because when you provide the answer, they will deny it. They will say you're misinterpreting the actions. And we begin to ask the question, why do people not want to hear the answer? And we discovered, if we have time, we can talk about this in terms of racial dialogues, 4 levels of defenses that occurs, within the individuals. We published a number of studies on this. The first level, why are well-intentioned white brothers and sisters so fearful about honestly talking about race? The first level we find when we begin to pose this question to them is that they are fearful that whatever they say or do is going to be perceived as racist. So they engage in what individuals call rhetorical incoherence. They stammer. They make statements that don't make sense. They tiptoe around the topic. They are not precise in their language. They fumble and stumble over words related to common words, that get them close to topics of race, racism, whiteness, and white privilege. And so we observe this. So one of the things is that people are fearful they're going to be perceived as being racist. So they engage in these defensive maneuvers, but people of color who observe it believe they are more racist because of those actions and things. So it's undermining their thought. But what we find is that there are 3 other levels. I can't go to them. The second level is the realization that you do harbor biases and prejudices. It is inescapable that you harbor, because you have been born and raised in a society that you inherit the racist, heterosexist, sexist, beliefs and attitudes that is present in our society. So one of the most difficult things that people have to work through is the belief that they are somehow immune from inheriting these biases. And as long as that defensive maneuver is up there, you do not go to the other level of understanding white privilege and the ability to take anti-racist actions, because it is very difficult. And you almost have to go through all 4 of those in order to really be an enlightened individual who will become an ally This is one of the things that our most recent research is on, the difference between, we identified 3 groups in terms of what they can do to engage in anti-bias behaviors. The targets, the white allies, and the innocent so-called bystanders. And we found differences in all three groups, and the strategies might be quite different from all of them. But this is something that I want you to think about in terms of looking at this things. This is a definition of microaggressions. They're brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities. They can be intentional or unintentional, but they communicate really put-downs, indignities, slights, primarily because you belong to a marginalized group in this society here. These are characteristics that we found about microaggressions. They are the most, well, this is something, there was some research to find that micro-invalidation, remember the 3 forms of microaggressions I talked about? Micro-assaults, micro-insults, and micro-invalidations. Something that we've been finding out is that people of color find it much more easy to deal with a micro-assault. There's no guesswork where a person is coming from. It's the people who are engaging in micro-insults and micro-invalidations. Micro-invalidations are, we consider, to be more detrimental, more harmful to people of color than the other forms. I mean, they're all bad and impactful, but micro-invalidations deny the experiential reality of people of color. And something that I always like to say is that if you look at it this way, the racial reality of white Americans as a group is different from the racial reality of people of color. I'm not saying that there are variations to this, and I don't want to stereotype, but the racial reality of people of color sees things, and people always ask whose reality is the accurate reality. And this is really an important question, because people will say, oh, we just differ in our belief. That's not true. What social psychologists have done in terms of oppression, discrimination, is that they have found that groups that are most disempowered have the most accurate perception of reality than those groups that have power. And it makes sense to me if you begin to think about it in this way. If you are an employee of color working in a large corporation, you really have to understand the thinking of white individuals, co-workers, in order to do well. White people don't need to understand people of color in order to do well in that particular society. The same situation with women. For women to do well in a male corporate society, they have to understand the thinking of men, but men don't have to understand the thinking of women in order to advance and do well. And if you carry this to the other extreme, it's common sense that if you really want to understand sexism, do you ask men or women? If you really want to understand racism, do you ask whites or people of color? It's commonsensical to me. And yet, if you look at how Congress operates, on women's issues, they will have a panel of people that are all men. And the people who are testifying about women issues are men. To me, this is truly baffling. in terms of common sense understanding of particular situations. Microaggressions can occur oftentimes in classrooms. A colleague of mine did a study of 3 community colleges in New York. Her original intent was to categorize and the types of microaggressions and the frequency of microaggressions from white students towards students of color. And her team would go in to these 3 places and tally the microaggressions. You know what they found? The most frequent microaggressions came from the professors. And this is really a statement that we have to think about quite carefully. When you have power, how does a student who experiences a microaggression from a professor deal with the power differential in which a professor can give you a lower grade, see you as a outspoken, rabble-rouser, many things. There are economic, and even in the world of work, we find this to be true, that supervisors, executives who microaggress, the huge power differential prevents people from pointing out these situations or issues to people here. And so what we find is that microaggressions represent almost toxic rain in the classroom and on the campus here. Let me talk about, academia. One of the things that really that I've been impressed with, because people know I do all the work on microaggressions, students of color, even though a teacher's college does not have an undergraduate population, we're all graduate school. Oftentimes, however, we have interactions with the main campus with undergraduate students. Undergraduate students, because they know the type of work that we've been doing, will come in to me and during office hours and talk about how they feel alienated from the college environment and campus, how the textbooks don't seem to reflect their lived experience and reality. And they talk about, even less so now, about how the food and events tend to not make them feel at home. They feel out like an outsider, the only one. But when you talk to white students, not all white students, because some white students feel that Columbia climate is really impersonal, and so, but they oftentimes talk about feeling affirmed, liberated, that this is home for them. And you have 2 different perceptions of the campus climate that is going on. And what we find, and let me go to this, I'm not going to, these are examples of racial microaggressions. A black student, given this example, is complimented by the teacher as being articulate and bright, and the hidden message is that most blacks are inarticulate and lack intelligence. A 3rd-generation Asian American student is complimented by a white classmate for speaking such good English. And the hidden communication here, some international students tell me that when they're talking with a group of students, that some white students speak extra slow to them. I want to tell you what the assignment is. And they feel really quite insulted. And this also happens to Asian American students. But there are gender microaggressions. A female resident at the medical school wearing a stethoscope is mistaken by medical students for a nurse. And they'll ask where the doctor is, in this way. Male students in private refer to a female teacher as a bitch, while their male counterparts are described as decisive and assertive teachers. You have all of these, and I'm not going to, sexual orientation, microaggressions occur, other socially devalued groups. One of the interesting things is students oftentimes will make a statement when they're bargaining over a used book, saying, "Don't try to Jew me down." These are a blind student. Actually, this also comes from Richard Keller, head of our Disability Center at Teachers College. He's legally blind. And he says oftentimes that when new faculty are introduced to him, the new faculty member will walk over to him and say, "Good morning, Richard, how are you?" And Richard's response is, "I can hear perfectly well, thank you." That's because the belief here is the person with a disability is defined lesser in almost all aspects of functioning. Let me give you the findings, the research, and I've cited this. Socially devalued groups often experience the campus climate as isolating, alienating, extremely stressful, risky, and invalidating. It would really be of interest to ask women, LGBTQ students of color, how they perceive the new school campus climate. And I think that you would find, of course, oftentimes when I suggest this, and I do this in corporations as well, suggest that they interview a group of your employees of color, they will oftentimes say we don't want to do that. And I said, why? What's wrong? Well, we don't want to open up a can of worms. And I will say, if you don't open up the can, does it mean the worms aren't there? And I know what's coming on here, but you are likely to get a completely different perception. And by knowing what causes you to feel an invalidating, alienating, hostile climate on the campus, gives you some idea of possible changes that you might want to engage in. They are more likely to experience being the only one that leads to feelings of isolation and loneliness. And this generally occurs the higher up you go in the employment or the graduation thing. I was asked several years ago, maybe more than several years ago, by Harvard University to do a 1.5-day workshop for all the deans of the college. And as I was being introduced by the moderator, I scanned the room of deans. It was a whole program that Harvard did, 1-week program. Those are my grandkids, I think. Let me silence it. I mean, sometimes they're in California, and when they get off, they keep, they'll send me, I won't describe it. Well, where was I? I was standing, it was a 1-week program that was titled, How to Make Harvard a More Welcoming Environment for Faculty and Students of Color. And it was a week-long event. They had ethnic celebrations, food, town hall meetings, videos, and my role was to work with all the deans of Harvard. But as I was standing in front of them and being introduced, I scanned the room and they all appeared white. White males especially. There were white women, but they were associate or assistant deans primarily. So when I got up, I said that as I stand before you today and scan the room of faces here, I may be wrong, but you all appear white. You can't imagine how uncomfortable they were shuffling their feet, trying to understand. And I said to them, do you know the communication you are sending to prospective faculty and students of color? And I said, there are 3 messages. One of them, you're not welcome here. Secondarily, if you come here, you won't be comfortable. Third message, intended or not, if you persist in coming, there is only so far up the ladder that you will go at Harvard. As a student of color, you may not graduate. As a faculty of color, you may not be promoted and tenured. And so what I'm saying is that this experience of being the only one is a powerful message that is an environmental microaggression. And again, most people don't see it. I mean, this whole group of deans, I'm sure they're kind of aware that we're not a diverse administration, but they don't realize how powerful this has on the lived reality and lived experience of individuals of color here. Let me go, they lack mentors who possess knowledge of the minority experience. In other words, the new school and almost all institutions may have a student service, a student affairs, a counseling center, and it is very important that you have people who understand the lived reality and experience of people of color. And when you have a counseling center, for example, they used to at Columbia, where there were white counselors, they were all PhD or social work individuals, well-intentioned, talked diversity, but they were unable to tap the lived experience or reality. And oftentimes, and this is something in my field in terms of multicultural counseling and therapy, many well-intentioned white helping professionals will profess colorblindness. A person may come in and say, geez, I'm not doing well, or can you really understand what it's like to be the only Latinx student on this campus? And the helping professional, in an attempt to reassure the person, say, I'm sure I can. I've worked with many Latino students before. In fact, I believe that we are individuals. We're all individuals, or we share a universal identity. And there is an avoidance of tapping or touching the group identity level, which is race, gender, sexual orientation, because of hang-ups that are occurring. And they don't realize, this is one of the things that we have found out, why students of color, terminate or not return with sessions of the staff. And that's primarily, they will go away when saying that Dr. So-and-so just doesn't understand when I'm talking to them. More damaging is when they say to me that, after I got out of that session, I felt worse than when I went in. And there is a sense of silencing and oppression that does not allow the person to talk about their racial, cultural factors here. They have, they have their contributions and scholarship devalued and considered illegitimate. This goes to the heart, not only of students. We conducted studies at Teachers College in which we had a group of faculty of color, a group of white faculty, a group of white students, and a group of students of color. And this was a study of 4 different groups in which we were trying to identify intersecting themes. The first thing, what we were trying to do was study why is it so difficult for people to dialogue on race? And these are two findings that I want you to realize. We found that almost all difficult dialogues on race was triggered by a racial microaggression in class. And we found something else, that while the professors and students of color could recognize what was causing the difficult dialogue, white students and white faculty as a group had great difficulty understanding what creates the difficult dialogue. They knew something was wrong. They knew that there was tension that was going on, but they could not put their fingers in terms of what was going on. In our work, we oftentimes, and because what happens is that oftentimes the white professor are oblivious to microaggressions, and even though they may want to identify it, they're paralyzed. They don't know what to do. And one of the greatest fears about why faculty avoid race topics that generate powerful emotions is that they are fearful of losing control of the classroom. They are fearful that this will become the classroom from hell, and that students will storm out, go to the dean, go to the president and department chairs, and complain that the such and such did this, and it really creates a turmoil. So what do professors do? They table the discussion. They avoid the topic. They will oftentimes say to someone, calm down, let's respect one another and talk about this in a logical, rational way. And what they are failing to recognize is the characteristics of difficult dialogues on race and the need to deal with embedded and nested emotions and feelings. That dealing with race is not simply a cognitive or intellectual exercise. You have to be skilled in terms of dealing with the emotive reactions that come out and allow them to be expressed. But when I was going to graduate school, I was taught that emotions are antagonistic to reason. It's irrational. And what other things that we're finding up is that that's a white Western perspective that is not necessarily shared by 3/4 of the world. African Americans, for example, believe passion in presenting or talking about a position is a representation of authenticity. That their white brothers and sisters who talk about being objective, removed, are inauthentic. And oftentimes I see this occur in the class. I know what you're saying, but what are your thoughts? And there's a difference. In Western culture, you are the spokesperson for a position, but among many African Americans, when you engage in a dialogue, you become an advocate. And so you have this clash of communication styles that are occurring in the classroom, and it varies with different groups. A control of strong feelings is often associated with Asian international students. And oftentimes professors misunderstand that this restraint of strong feelings is not repression, is not lack of interest and involvement in the classroom. A lot of different things become important to look at. They have their racial or gender identities assailed. Derald, why are you always talking about Asian American? You're unique. Or we're all human beings under the skin. And they don't realize that they are negating an important aspect of my racial cultural identity. One of the sayings that I really like is not my saying. To be colorblind is to be color mute. In other words, if you, by the way, you cannot be colorblind. Developmental studies indicate that from at about 3 months to 6 months, infants can determine differences, and they study it through eye movement and eye contact. And two of the most distinguishing characteristics that infants point out is race and gender. They note those so that, things that I don't see color, I know what someone might be saying, but that's not true. And oftentimes people are fearful to talk about race, culture, ethnicity, because they're going to get into hot water, and they're fearful again of being labeled a racist. So they pretend not to see color. They engage in what I call strategic colorblindness in their interactions with others. And this is really an important issue. When you don't see color, you deny the racialized experiences of people of color. And that is something that many people of color will immediately feel put off when you claim or act as if you don't notice that they are racially different than you. They experience elevated levels of stress and distress. This is where, in fact, the more recent, Philip Ong and his research team, I was part of it, studied diary recordings of physiological responses of individuals on days that they experienced microaggressions and days that they didn't. And what we did find out was that on days that they recorded microaggressions, physiologically they felt stress and felt unwell. The other studies that come out of other people indicate that racial microaggressions take a physical toll on individuals. And think about it, that the normal state of vigilance is associated with people of color. You're constantly on guard. You're constantly having to ward off microaggressions. And if you think about elementary school children, students of color experiencing microaggressions, they're constantly tense, uptight, vigilant, always, when information comes to them, always having to say, I'm worth something. I'm bright, I'm intelligent, I'm not stupid. And when you think about, and this is what one researcher called racial battle fatigue, the constant onslaught of warding off microaggressions take a heavy toll on the individual physically. They're subjected to biased classroom evaluation and grading decisions. One of them, for example, if you consider to be class participation an important aspect of getting a good grade in class, you have to understand that there are a lot of students from different cultures, especially international students, where verbal participation is not something that they're used to. So as a teacher, you're going to have to change alternative ways of reaching them. Otherwise, you are imposing a method of teaching and evaluation that oppresses individuals. And lastly, to have many more students and teachers question their qualifications, intelligence, or judgment. And this goes to the heart of professors. Now I know what I was trying to do. I sidetracked. I was talking about professors of color experiencing microaggressions, which they do in our study. One professor of color said that at the beginning of a semester in a course, he went in and started lecturing. And several white students, female students, kept thumbing through their book and saying, raising their hand, I can't find that in the textbook. And he saw it as if a white professor would have given the the same presentation, it would have been accepted here. And that's what, or one teacher told me that when he would explain a concept, a science concept, to some students, and he was an African-American professor, he found that student went to a white professor in the science department to make sure that was correct. I mean, these are constant slights and indignities that are good on. This professor, by the way, says that I ward off microaggressions now. I will come in and tell them where I got my doctorate, the research that I have done, and on, in order to establish credibility that makes it less possible for them to undermine his intelligence and authority. I'm going to skip this because I do want to leave a half hour for let me go over this. This was a finding that I share with people because one of the things that happens is that I've been talking about microaggressions affecting the psychological and physical well-being of an individual. Microaggressions are also related to inequities in education, healthcare, and employment. And I can look at this and ask you the question, white Euro-American males are only 33% of the population. They occupy 80% of tenured positions in higher education. They are 80%, it's varying now, of the House of Representatives. They vary between 80 to 90% of the US Senate. They are 92% of Forbes 400 executive CEO level positions. Shortly, the New York Times is going to come out with a list of the 100 most highly paid CEOs. Every year they have this annual issue, and if you look at it, they're all primarily white men. They are 90% of public school superintendents. This is astounding because it's a profession dominated by women. They are 99.9% of athletic team owners. This last statistic gives us much hope. They are now, actually, this was done before Trump became president. It's now 99.93% of US presidents. And I like to joke by saying, unless there is something we don't know about Thomas Jefferson, in terms of the situation. Now, the questions I ask is, where are the women? Where are the people of color? And are these inequities, disparities, due to the overt racists, the white supremacists? And the answer really is no. It's due to ordinary people like you and me, people who go to the voting booths, teachers who teach our children, employers who determine who they're going to hire for the positions that are going on. That's what creates it. So this is one of the harmful impacts of microaggressions, that it goes to the standard of living that people of color experience. I'm going to go to this. One of the things that I want to talk about is that, I gave you the example earlier about how many of my colleagues said that I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. Microaggressions are harmless, trivial, and insignificant. We reviewed the literature, conducted a few studies to find out, is there a difference between rudeness, everyday rudeness that is not group-based, versus those that are race or gender-based? And there's been a study by Wong and colleagues that indicate that group-based are much more damaging. And this is the reason why. Why is it so? Microaggressions are constant and continual without an end date. An everyday rude clerk that you encounter, after the rudeness, you're angry and uncomfortable, but it's over. For people of color, they experience microaggressions from the time they are born until they die. From the time they awaken in the morning, like this African American individual says, and to the time that they go to bed. Secondarily, microaggressions are cumulative, and any one itself may represent the straw or feather that breaks the camel's back. You know, if you have a black student working at, let's say, a cafeteria, a school cafeteria, no, not working at the school cafeteria, a black student walks into the school cafeteria and gets asked by white students to clear the table. And she explodes and gets angry. And people will think, what an overreaction. I apologize. Why is it so? Why is she behaving that way? They don't see that perhaps this is a fourth time that the student of color has experienced similar microaggressions. And it simply represents, I can't take it anymore. In terms of understand the cumulative nature. And that is one of the things that many of my white brothers and sisters doing research on racism don't realize that it's a constant, continual experience that people of color have, not just a single isolated incident. Years ago, when we had racist graffiti written on the Columbia restroom stalls and everything, the administration came out and condemned those acts when students of color objected and formed groups. And during the town hall meeting, the dean who ran the town hall meeting said that these are isolated incidents. We condemn them. And one black student got up and said, when you have hundreds of isolated incidents going on, when does it become the rule rather than the exception? And that is the point here that we need to look at, that it's a continuing aspect here. Microaggressions are energy depleting because you have to decipher the double messages that are constantly sent here. Microaggressions are constant reminders of a person's second-class status in society. And lastly, they symbolize past historic injustices. They symbolize the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. And in fact, 2/3 of the 110,000 that were incarcerated were citizens by virtue of birth. They symbolize the taking away of land of Native Americans. They symbolize the enslavement of black people from Africa. I mean, and you know, a lot of people will say, well, this never happened. My father, my mother, my grandparents weren't responsible. We didn't own slaves. We didn't such and such. And I always say to them, that's true. But do you realize that you still benefit from those past historic injustices that have gone on? And again, it represents what Native Americans call now historical trauma. And to tell someone to forget about this, because it doesn't apply now, is very similar to telling your Jewish brothers and sisters, forget the Holocaust. It is something real that is becoming important here. Studies reveal, and I'll stop after I share this with you, in terms of the harmful impact, they increase stress in the lives of people. The American Psychological Association in 2017 and 2018 surveyed 3,000 participants entitled Stress in America. And what they found was that 75% of African Americans indicated that they experience microaggressions every day. And Native Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinx Americans had a high level too, but African Americans had the highest, while white people, in terms of incivilities, were very low. So that they are common things that occur to individuals here. They deny or negate the racialized experiences of people of color. They lower emotional well-being. We know for a fact that microaggressions are correlated with that. They increase depression and negative feelings. They assail the mental health of recipients. They impede learning and problem solving. This is something important for all of us in education, that microaggressions not only impede learning in the classroom, but work performance in the workplace as well. They impair employee performance. They take a heavy toll on the physical well-being of targets. They contribute, this is Claude Steele's concept, to stereotype threat, and they contribute to what Kevin Coakley calls the imposter phenomena, or the imposter syndrome. And in the studies of this phenomena of feeling, the imposter syndrome is feeling like you're an intellectual fraud. And despite the fact that many of our doctoral students are students of color who graduate with a PhD, who do excellent research, at the back of their mind, they still question whether they are good enough. It's really, and they feel like an imposter when they take a teaching position in terms of the situation here. So I guess what I would say is that these are some of the things that I think we have to do. We have to acknowledge and accept the fact that we are all products of our cultural conditioning. None of us are immune from inheriting the racial biases of our forebears. It's really important to note that, for example, for me to claim that I'm immune really is the height of naivete or lack of reality check. All of us go through a socialization process. And if your question gets to it, I can talk to you about how implicit bias and explicit bias moved from childhood to adulthood. And they are measurable in terms of this situation here. You have to begin to understand yourself as a racial cultural being. I am oftentimes amazed when I ask students, white students, what does it mean to be white? They'll get upset, defensive. What are you talking about? I'm not white. I'm Irish. And what they are feeling is that their inability to understand their whiteness means something totally different, gives them a totally different experience that they go through. And it's because whiteness in our society is a default standard. If I ask Black students, Asian students, Latinx students about what does it mean to be a Latino, a Latina, they are able to talk about it. And this is one thing I find a major obstacle. I will frequently ask white students, when I get up in the morning and I look in the mirror, I'm shaving, I know I'm Asian. I know that I'm Asian American. And I ask white students, when you get up in the morning and look in the mirror, do you say, geez, I'm white? No, you don't. And it's because everything around you is invisible, and it's this invisibility that oftentimes creates a situation where you engage in oppression with other people. You have to be open and honest about your vulnerabilities. I'm not going to read these statements from people. You have to monitor and make sense of your emotional reactions. Why am I getting angry? Why am I getting defensive? Skip the emotional. Do you see how optimistic I was in terms of getting to this? The last thing I'll end with is that everyone commits blunders. No one is immune. When you commit a blunder, it's really how you recover rather than how you cover up. If I commit a blunder, in fact I did a couple of weeks ago, a racial blunder with one of my students, the immediate reaction you oftentimes have is becoming defensive. And it is very different to be open to the feedback. And that's what I really want to do. I never want to be dismissed when I commit a racial, gender, sexual orientation blunder without an opportunity to understand what it is that I did and, in terms of this issue here. So I'm going to stop there. I think we have about 25 minutes or so. Thank you. Thank you. And by the way, you're welcome to the slide, if PowerPoint slide, because it all comes from different research and books that you can find anyway. But what are some of the comments or questions that you might have?
Dr. Su, thank you for being here. And I want to say thank you for your work and your research. As a Black woman, when I was an early PhD student, it was the words that I had to give to my white professors at my PWI to say, there's more to the story, right, about how we do this work. I'm a counseling psychologist by training, and so this has been foundational to me, and it motivated my dissertation, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, thank you. You've been seminal to many of us, I think, throughout the country. A couple of questions. I'll try to be quick. One is, so I've worked at many counseling centers, including at Columbia as a postdoc, and one of the things is I was working a lot with students of color, and queer students of color, and they would come in presenting with symptoms that on the surface would look like depression, anxiety, et cetera, and in the back of my mind, I'm familiar with Dr. Smith's research on racial battle fatigue, and I'm wondering, how do we get a Z code that's racial battle fatigue, right? Like, how do we not have to pathologize that distress that is really, I think, sometimes adaptive responses to the racism that students are experiencing on these campuses? That's one. And two is, on that note, a lot of our faculty of color, staff of color, are doing the work to sit with our students of color, doing emotional labor, extra labor, where their white counterparts are publishing, writing, speaking, and advancing their careers, while faculty of color are spending a lot of times on open hours that extend to 3 or 4 hours during the week instead of 1, or being on committees for outside of their department because students just want, please just have one Black faculty on my committee. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about it.
That's very complicated in terms of, one of the things that, let's deal with the first question first, and that is that I have great difficulties labeling racism as pathological, because it is such a normative, it allows people to say, oh, if I can find it in DSM, it applies to only sick people. And what I find is that it's the normal, healthy individuals that really have these biases and that come out of them, and that they have to confront that particular situation. The second thing is that I think that white faculty need education. They need to begin to understand what is the unfairness of the situation that they have. And part of it resides in, I would say, performance appraisal systems. In the criteria, in business and industry, actually, it's called performance appraisal systems. But in the university setting is, promotion and tenure. And the promotion and tenure does not recognize other aspects other than publication being at the top and very important. A sensitive administrator would in actuality allow maybe extra time, release time or so forth for faculty that serve as a support group for individuals. And unfortunately, this is the advice I give to a lot of students of color. They'll come in and I'll say that you have to find a support group. And indeed, it is the support group that they usually look for is faculty and staff of color, because they share, but they can't do it alone. And by me recommending that, in essence, I'm placing faculty of color in a bind where they have a dual obligation. And it's a very difficult thing. I think administration needs to look at this very carefully, and make changes. And this is where I want to define why it's important for us to understand what macroaggressions are. A lot of people think that a police officer is shooting someone. That's not a microaggression, that's a macroaggression. Well, in essence, it is a microaggression, but it has a macro impact. Microaggressions reside in the institutional attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors of individuals. Macroaggressions are institutional policies, practices, structures, and programs that allow certain groups to rise and hold down others. And oftentimes, the university rules and regulations are macroaggressions. And I would say that in looking at the promotion and tenure standards, that they may represent macroaggressions. And I can give an example of this in business and industry. Procter & Gamble years ago asked me to come to do assertiveness training for their Asian employees. Now that seemed funny to me immediately. Is this a stereotype? And I asked them, well, why are you asking that? And they said that we conducted a company-wide survey and found they had something like 20+% of Asian American and Asian technical workforce. And when they separated out the responses, they found that 80% of Asian American employees said that they planned to leave the company within 5 years. And when asked why, they said that they were not promoted when otherwise qualified. And when I talked to the management team, one of the things that they said was that, I know this will sound very racist. When I hear that statement, I immediately, I know this is going to sound racist, but Asian Americans don't make good leaders and managers. That was their statement. And they need to learn to be more assertive and to take charge. And I said, well, then how do companies in China, Tokyo, how do those businesses prosper? And their statement was that leadership might be different. And I said, no, leadership is very similar. To Asians and Asian Americans, leadership is the quality of an individual who works behind the scenes, garnering cooperation and increasing productivity. And I said to them, why don't you go back and do this? Ask teams, different teams, who was most instrumental in increasing the productivity of the team. And that's when Asian names came to the top. And I said, well, look at your performance appraisal system. And in the performance appraisal system, where you have criteria for managers and things, there were things like take charge, highly visible, assertive. In fact, some were aggressive in terms of, and they were saying Asians don't really participate a lot in the common, and I was indicating to them that this is a culture-bound bias in the performance appraisal system, that they were losing effective individuals who could make good leaders and produce. And I think that I don't have all the answers to promotion and tenure. I come from Columbia that despite the fact that there are the 4 categories, teaching, advising, good citizenship with committee work and on, the highest priority, and they say they're all equal, the highest priority really is getting research grants and publishing. This is something that we need to address and talk to people. There are changes going on, especially in the field of counseling psychology. There's more and more movement to making qualitative research, for example, more acceptable than equally acceptable as quantitative research. But this is a situation that requires massive institutional change. Yes?
You mentioned really early about your research about what to do. So if a student experiences a microaggression in class, and there's this power dynamic between them and the instructor, what can they do to make the room safe again?
Probably unless they go to someone else. In our studies on micro interventions, we identified 4 different strategies. One was to make the invisible visible. For example, let me give you an example of that. Instead of, when a student compliments me for speaking good English, I try to undermine the communication. The example I gave to you was, thank you, I hope so, I was born here. It undermines their communication that I'm a foreigner, a perpetual alien. But there are other ways to do it too. Professor Sue, you speak excellent English. John, you do too. These are micro interventions. They're short checkmates, not long elaborations that stop the microaggression from occurring. But one of them is to make the invisible visible. The other one is to educate the perpetrator. And educating the perpetrator, one of the strategies, there are many strategies, but one of them is to have them distinguish between intent and impact. A person begins to tell a racist joke. And you can say something, if it's told, say, I know you meant that to be funny, but that really upset and hurt Aisha. You separate that so that the person becomes educated about their impact. The third one is to disarm the microaggression. It's a direct frontal attack to end it. And again, it can be very simple. Those people are always like that. Ouch. Let me tell you a joke about, quicksand ahead. I don't want to go there. So there are a lot of strategies. The fourth one that I think is perhaps most effective when power differential exists is to seek outside support and help. It is really asking a lot for a student to confront a professor about a microaggression unless that professor you believe is very open to it. I told you about 3 weeks ago, I did a microaggression. The doctoral student was courageous. I knew I had done it, and I toyed with the idea of bringing it up. He called for an appointment to talk, and he raised it. He was courageous. But I think he sensed that I would be receptive to hearing that. Not all professors are. They may say they are, but they will get defensive about it. So you have to approach it indirectly. Is there another professor or another administrative or a higher level or equal level individual that you can share it with, in which it can be communicated back to them? But seeking support and help is the fourth category, because there is danger to intervening when a bias being, there not only economic danger, there may be physical danger. Some of you might have heard about the incident in Portland, Oregon, where on the train that was going on, a Muslim woman in headdress was harangued by a white man, and two other white individuals came to her to intervene, and he stabbed both of them with a knife. So what I'm saying is that you have to really, when you encounter situations like that, you have to understand the situation and context that you're involved in. Now, what does that mean for all of us who have to, my blood pressure rises when I feel like I can't engage in something that is going on. And the thing that you have to know is that there's a difference between assimilation and acculturation, forced compliance, and maintaining your integrity. Selling out is different from functional survival, engaging in the behaviors that will get you through that particular situation. And I think it's really important to know that, by the way, in January 2019, we published a major taxonomy of micro-interventions that I've been talking about in the American Psychologist. It's called Disarming Microaggressions, micro-intervention tactics and strategies for targets, allies, white allies, and bystanders. And like I was saying, all three of them are different because bystanders, the major obstacle to them taking action is that they don't see it. The microaggression that happens is invisible to them. The ally is really stuck between being non-racist and anti-racist. Do you understand what you can go through and develop a non-racist identity, but being anti-racist means that you take action. And I've oftentimes looked at why is it so difficult for people to take action. And that's our study now. It's a major work. We're nearly done with it. It's up to about 130 pages, which the journal, by the way, has agreed to allow us to use that many pages to talk about the three types. See, it's real, we're going into what are micro-interventions. There are three types. There's micro-affirmations, micro-protections, and micro challenges. Those are the three forms. They are being borne out through other studies that are going on. Micro-protections are most likely used by parents of color with their children, having them be able to anticipate what is coming in terms of their racialized experiences. Among African American colleagues, they talk about the concept, the talk, having the talk with your black son and daughter about the danger that they need to see. But I think in this case, to advocate that someone take action when they don't have power is to to deny the possible negative repercussions and consequences.
Maybe take a few more questions.
Yes, yes.
This is really fascinating, and to hear it from you directly is really great because it's a term that gets used so much. I'm curious about, in terms of thinking about micro interventions or even macro interventions, is there a tension between what you described when you were first defining microaggressions and the kind of presumption, even in a complementary way, that like a certain group acts a certain way, whether it's negatively or positively? And then another problem that you identified, which was kind of overstating the individualism of someone, whether it's through color blindness or saying like, oh, you're you and you can do anything and and it seems to me that I understand why those are both microaggressive, but it also seems like in navigating this, how does one do that?
Yeah, you're talking about something that is important because there's 3 levels of identity that people have. There's what I call the individual level of identity, the group level of identity, and the universal level. The individual level of identity is that, yes, in many respects, no 2 people are identical. We are unique, and to understand that is important. The universal level says that as human beings, we have universal things that we share, language. Consciousness is something that we all share. Life and death, those are qualities. And it's the Shakespearean character who says, when I cut myself, do I not bleed? That we all have similarities. It is a group level of identity that is most difficult for people to deal with. And the group level of identity deals with race, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. And it's really important for us to be able to touch all 3 levels because, and even within the group identity, salience may vary. We have multiple identities. Supposing I'm a gay, male, Asian, there's already 3 identities that are intersecting. My Asian identity may be more salient when I'm with my LGBTQ friends. However, my gay identity may be more salient to me when I'm with my Asian friends. And it is very difficult. But I know when one of my identities is being dismissed. Or being avoided or negated. And that's the impact, not the fact that the person who says we're all unique, we're all individuals, is wrong, but I sense that they are negating another aspect of my identity.
Maybe you could collect a few so we get them in.
Pardon?
Maybe you could collect 2 or 3 so that people
Okay.
get a chance to.
Okay.
Hello. So you mentioned the multicultural event hosted at Harvard University that you
Yes.
participated in. I was curious to know how can people of color express our concerns about microaggressions without perpetuating this issue of effective labor, which, if anyone doesn't know, effective labor is when people of color are given this burden to educate white people on their racism, when essentially white people created racism and they're the ones that are supposed to be unlearning this these systemic injustices. How can, without perpetuating this issue of effective labor or educating white people on their racism? Yeah.
It's unfair, but really what I sense is that people of color will always be the racial conscience of America. And we don't even have to say things about it. Our mere physical differences pricks the conscience of white America. And I think that if you look at the history of racism and racial movements, it has always been people of color who have taken the initiative to put this to the forefront. It doesn't mean that white people should avoid responsibility. They have responsibility, strong responsibility. But like I was saying, what am I doing? I'm going around doing workshops, teaching classes, and training. And it's a funny thing. I no longer feel depleted of energy. In fact, it is invigorating to me to be able to say the truth and express my integrity without always having to cover it. I'm energized by it. And I was not like this when I was younger. When I first taught courses on diversity, it was terrible. I mean, I would feel like I was in internal struggle with many of my white students. There were times I felt like taking a hammer and pounding them over the head. Why can't you understand and see this? It was when I was able to divorce that they aren't the problem. They aren't the enemy. It's white supremacy that is the enemy. It's white superiority that is the enemy, and that white people, like individuals of color, are equally victimized through a socialization process. Victimization of white people is different than victimization of people of color. But I guess, in fact, I wrote about this in my book, that it's unfair. But the truth of the matter is that people of color are always going to be the conscience of white America, constantly prodding them, whether guilt, shame, appealing to morals, or forcing change. This is something, a reality that I've accepted. One more.
So I think there were two more, if we can get them in.
Okay.
I'm a member of the Sanctuary Working Group here, and we center in our activism the experiences of undocumented students and students of color. And unsurprisingly, I mean, it rings so true, everything that you're presenting, right? We're a predominantly white institution. Common experiences like people go to student affairs, student financial services, a student from a mixed status family, their parent is undocumented, is accused of lying when they file their FAFSA because they don't have documentation about the parent's income, or that people's hands are shaking because they think it might be illegal to help someone who's undocumented. And yet we, as a university, we promote this public image of ourselves as being a social justice university, a progressive university. I'm wondering, should we think of it as a microaggression to call ourselves a social justice university and to call ourselves a progressive university because it represents one racial reality, right? And it negates the daily experience of so many people.
Yeah. We have the same problem at Teachers College. We have a beautiful social justice statement, and I'm not sure that we practice it. And this is a, dilemma I think that most organizations have here, and I'm going to leave it in your hands. Okay, one more.
Hi. First, I just wanted to really thank you for all this information you shared with us today. It's been very insightful. And then I have just a quick comment and then a question. But I really appreciate how you talked about, you made yourself vulnerable and said how you made a mistake and you made a racial comment and how a student approached you. And what I like to say, what I like to call that is calling people in instead of calling them out. And I tend to do that with a lot of my, like white people that might be in my circle and say, hey, I want to call you in on this topic that you said, and not call them out because I think using the term calling them out makes them defensive. And so I just always find that really helpful. And then you talked briefly on imposter syndrome, and it's something that in my own career, I'm sorry, I'm not a student here. I just flew in from Seattle, which is a very white state, and I'm visiting my cousin who's a faculty member here. But I'm a black farmer in an all-white community, and imposter syndrome is something that I really struggle with, and to the brink of I thought I was so unqualified in my knowledge and skills that I decided to go back to school to get more skills and experience, to find out that I knew everything that I needed to know. And so I guess I've seen a lot of people of color do like how you said, where you mentioned they announce their qualifications. And I've paid attention to other people in different books. My Grandmother's Hands, he does it in the beginning of that book as well. And I'm wondering, what other ways can I validate my qualifications, either in my working life or my professional, other careers and things like that? How can I say, I'm qualified for this without going down my resume, and other ways that we can fight imposter syndrome?
You know, I guess I would say that you need a social support group that validates who you are as a racial, cultural being. I mean, people of color do it all the time. At Columbia, if a student or a professor makes a microaggression that they're unaware of, what I observe is that all students of color make eye contact with one another. You know, it's kind of like, it happened, don't doubt yourself. And so the other thing about the language, you know, when I talk about microaggressions, I'm not telling people of color anything new that they don't know already. But what they tell me is that it really provides a language for me to describe my experiences, and it reassures me that I'm not crazy. And the converse of that many white people have difficulty accepting, is that they know they've said that, but they don't see it as microaggressions. And the concept of microaggressions in language makes them very uncomfortable. But I would say find a support group, and find a group that is belonging. You need cultural nutrients. You can't, very few people can do it on their own. And micro-affirmations really are strategies and techniques that come from people close to you who say, you belong, we care about you, you're bright, you're intelligent, don't give up. That's the communication that you need from what we call social support. And our work on social support is indicating it's the most powerful method of dealing with the harmful impact of microaggressions, because it has two components: social integration and social support through perceived ways of coping with situations. And those comes from, emotional support, informational support, what we call, target support and belonging support. And if you are strong in that, then you have more resilience and hardiness. Okay, thank you. My voice is giving out.
Thank you very much.